All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. We are happy to be joined today by our special industry guest, David D'Arcangelo from Susquehanna Energy. It also sounds like we have some more special guests from Dr. Roundy's Subseasonal meteorology class. So with that, we will get started. I figured today we'd stick to the typical routine, talk about most recent verification, then go into our forecast. We'll let Dave talk about his for a little bit, and then we can, brainstorm, ask any questions, things like that. So starting off with the most recent verification, we made a forecast on February 18th. It was for the period of March 4th to March 8th. And if I scroll based on our skill metric, we can see that overall it was a pretty tough forecast for everyone. Verification down on the bottom here was 92.8 HDDs. And we can see for the most part, all of our human forecasters were colder than the 30-year normal, hence all of us receiving negative skill scores. But I will add that Dr. Roundy and Philip both had positive scores due to the fact that they were both directionally correct. They're on the warm side of the 30-year. But overall, it seems that a lot of us had a pretty difficult time fully grasping how warm it was going to be. We can see that, again, like I said, consensus, basically the average of all of our forecasts were were cold. We all had a pretty tough time. So I figured I'd go into some of the details about what the period looked like. This is Maxar's Dynacast page. We can see that for the period of March 4th to March 8th, year 2020. This is what we're looking at for average temperature departures. We can see very, very strong warmth across basically the entire country with a small blob of cold over the Carolinas and Georgia. This is a pretty stark difference from what we were looking at on the 18th. We can see this was Maxar's report from that day. You can see that Maxar was basically predicting the complete opposite of what actually happened. We can see that the EC was showing some cold, especially in that region where we saw the most warmth, and the CFS kind of showing the same thing. You can also see what the CPC was showing that day, and similar story, pretty dissimilar from what we were looking at that day. So that leads me to ask the question, or at least pose the question to all of you, what caused all of us, or what happened that caused everyone to be so far off? I mean, I know from when I was making my forecast that day, we had so many weeks of warm verifications that, part of me was probably looking for some sort of cold verification, trying to get ready for it. Obviously, I tried and it was wrong. I did change my forecast strategy that day, so that could have something to do with it. I did put some weight on the EC, which I don't remember exactly why I did that, but either way, does anybody have any thoughts as to why this period was so tough for all of us? Maybe Dr. Roundy, what did you see that led you to have such a strong forecast compared to the rest of us?
If I could just interrupt for 1 second. I just want to give the students just a chance to ask questions, because I know a lot of them are seeing this for the first time. And so again, these are forecasts, and they're in something called HDDs. I know you probably haven't heard of heating degree days, but that's just an industry measure. One of the things we really try to do is conform to industry standards, because again, that's a lot of the frustration that industry will hear is, hey, you got to put it in terms that we use, right? Don't put it in terms that you use in academia. So we require students to learn and get more accustomed to some of those industry metrics, and HD is one of them. And HD measures against a temperature of 65 degrees. So anytime, it's a winter metric, so anytime the average temperature is below 65, it counts as a degree. So 60 64 degrees is 1 HED, 63 is 2 HEDs, and so on. So the other thing, we won't go into detail here, but we provide all of the climate the HED information for you. We don't expect you to calculate the HED. What we expect you guys to do is come up with the right formulas and ways to combine the EC HDD, the CFS HDD, normal HDD, some other HDD that you, or some other metric that you guys think is relevant, MJO, whatever. So we provide some of these are automated, like the 15-year average, the 10-year average, normal 30-year. We provide all those, right? That's provided to you. You don't have to guess it. And then you can see a lot of the human forecasters then put together formulas to come up with a number. And you're going to hear more about that here in just a second, starting with Professor Roundy. And so it's a blend of human forecasts. I'm down here, unfortunately, folks, and you have your models, you have your verification, and again, climatology is. Then you have your forecast. We require you to put in your spread, your sigma value, right? Because again, that's a frustration that a lot of us have, that a 10-day forecast shouldn't be deterministic. It can't be, right? You have to put some probability range around it. That's your one standard deviation probability range. TRPS is our forecast metric. There's lots of different types of forecast metric. This is what we use. Again, offline, we can talk a little bit more about it. A positive is good as compared to the 30-year. Negative, and then the formulas and stuff. Before we turn it over to Paul, I know it's a lot, any questions? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We do have, in the forecast page and on this page, there's a way you can actually click and get more information. Zach, I don't know if you want to show that real quick. If you go to the forecast page. Yeah, I think you can, there's that question mark.
This one?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, so, again, we don't have to go through this all, but it's there, right? Exactly how they come up with the HD formula. Again, Maxar, the industry group, provides us all this data, thankfully, right? They give us this dump data. They calculate the national HED so that you don't have to try to figure out. They're going to give you the 30-year normal and say, hey, the national HED 30-year normal is 115. The 10-year normal, 110. The EC number is whatever. And then as you look at it over time, you'll start to get accustomed in terms of what to expect at different times of the year. You can't get too much. It is proprietary, so they're probably not going to tell you exactly how they calculate it, but basically it's like a population weighted of the country, focused on New York, Chicago, Atlanta, that kind of area, those areas. Any other questions? I think we're good here, so we'll turn it back to Paul. I think the question for Paul was his secret sauce in terms of doing so well this week.
You didn't ask me that when I did so poorly last week. So this time, for most of this season, I've had a lot of success with my tropical forcing statistical tools, but the Arctic situation has been becoming more and more anomalous in comparison with other years, and the strong potential vorticity gradients in the region of the Arctic has caused the waves, the Rossby wave forced by the tropical convection, to break in different places. And so I had to make kind of a mental correction to my statistics, this forecast. So it's, in the long run, I'm going to want to put some kind of modulator term in my tropical forcing statistical tools. We haven't covered those in the class yet. I'll talk about them probably in 2 or 3 weeks. But we would need to include some low frequency metric of the strength of the polar vortex, or the potential vorticity gradients at the periphery of the Arctic that govern where the waves break. That's all.
Easy peasy.
How about you, Dave D'Arcangelo? Did you, I don't know if you have your notes up from that period, but was there anything that you were looking at or you saw that would have led you to believe it was going to be such a warm verification, or would you have been, I don't know, fooled as well?
So my guess is I probably would have been fooled from the standpoint that I would have predicted something close to maybe just the 10 or the 30-year normal, and that actually is somewhat similar sentiment that I feel on today's forecast. But looking at some notes from that day, I think the few things that led everyone to lean in a colder, or at least average to colder direction, was the modeling. Both the Euro and the GFS were cold leaning late in the 11 to 15 day window, and coupled with that, the Euro weeklies were cold week 3, and the CFS was below normal, particularly centered in the south. What I did note, though, on some of my notes from that day, and this is probably not a word I use very often, was that the cold that was showing up on the modeling was occurring in a rather unorthodox fashion. And by unorthodox, I mean that it was doing so in a state where the AO-NAO complex was still strongly positive, and the EPO forecast, which had been trending closer to neutral, had been something that had been rather poorly predicted by all the modeling this winter. So leaning on the EPO index as a say a hinge to a colder forecast was seen, or should have been seen, as a relatively low confidence signal, because the seasonality means that we just haven't done well with that. So I guess I echo a little bit about what Dr. Roundy said, which is that looking at the Arctic and making some adjustment from that. But this was a challenging time because the modeling was all leaning in the colder direction for, I think you're verifying, for the first few days in March. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, 4th through the 8th.
Right. And I think one of the challenges that we have as forecasters is perhaps that the previous week to 10 days of this window, so the forecast was made on the 18th, and I think if we looked at a window from, say, around February 6th or 7th through that day, the southeast ridge had really kind of been nudged right to the east coast, and a decent amount of cold had actually filtered into the lakes, the greater Midwest, and all the way down into Texas. And so that you were facing a very short-term window that you were coming out of that was, well, had bucked, in a sense, the larger long-term winter trend, in that we were seeing some cold. And if you recall last week's verification, which was, I think, the previous target window, was actually a surprise in the opposite direction because it was so cold from Texas to the southeast and the mid-Atlantic, and verification was wrong in the other direction. So every time you're making a forecast, you're obviously, hindsight's 2020, but you are, whether we like it or not, somewhat influenced, perhaps by what you've witnessed just recently and maybe what your recent error has been.
Anybody else have some? Oh yeah, what's up, Dave?
Yeah, I was just curious. Dave said something about recent error. Can we take a quick look at like the 30 and 90 day just to see what the bias is?
I'll just do the smaller table.
So we have these, you can look at an archive of forecasts over different periods of time, which can sometimes provide different types of information. You see the bias here, you can sort that. So for example, CFS, the count here over the 5 forecasts, CFS has had a 15 HD cold bias, which is pretty significant. Can we see what it was for the heating season as a whole? 19.
Yeah.
Curious. Was CFS. So wow. Yeah. I mean, the reason I was thinking about that too is it's hard. One of the challenges, right, with subseasonal forecasting is, it's hard to make a synoptic forecast in the subseasonal range. In other words, it comes your variability like this, right, 5 and 7 day variability. So, Dave was mentioning last week, I think, verification was in it. But overall this winter, you look at the models, the CFS is not great. There's certainly been distinct, on average, cold models. The HDDs have been too high. Higher HDDs in the winter is colder, lower is warmer. CFS, on average, has been 17 HDDs too high.
So a 30-year fix is like 3.8.
And, anyway, it's not a. It's I think we talked about this last week or week two. So it's like if you have strong suspicion next month it's going to be warm, but you also, let's say, know there's going to be some inter-period variability, what's the best way to handle that, right? You just go with that warm signal every week and communicate to your clients, or whoever your stakeholder is, that fact that, you're not going to be right every time, but you think sort of 3 out of 4 weeks, you're going to get it right. And because you can't predict, because the synoptic variability is harder to predict than the overall signal, you're going to predict that signal, that the longer sort of pass signal, low pass signal,
But they're also
synoptic variability. But then last thing I'll say, it's hard after you come off of that because then there's human feelings, emotion. So let's say you just came off of that one period where it was colder. And let's say that colder period, that unexpected or that variability occurred in that first week of that transition period. All of a sudden you start to second guess yourself, right? You start to second guess like, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should back out of this, whatever. So I'm just trying to give an indication. You can probably see it just, as I kind of think about it, these are difficult things to deal with and they come up, the psychology of it comes up, especially when you're in industries where there's a lot of money being won and lost on the information you're providing. That's all I had. Any questions over here? Looks like we're good over here.
All right. Well, if anyone else have any last thoughts amongst our other participants today? All right. I will shift to this week's forecast then. So today is March 10th. We are forecasting for the period of March 25th to March 29th. Scroll over here. We can see the 30-year normal value is 86.2. Whereas 10-year normal is 81.4. I think Dave might have to fix this, but industry is showing a 0, which is not correct, I'm sure.
I have not put a forecast in. Yeah, I was a little busy.
Who's that? No, I think Dave Margolin, the industry number 1, our Maxar forecast is showing 0. So
yeah, that was because of my trip to Albany, I had to run things a little early this morning, and apparently I ran it before even Maxar made a forecast. So.
Okay, all right, we can fix that later then. So I think just for the sake of time, Dave Margolin or Dr. Roundy, if you guys want to talk about your forecast a little bit, so we can get you in before you have to go. Start off with you guys.
Yeah, and I was thinking here, Zach, we have 2 of the students here, sitting here, and we put them on the spot here in a second. We've got Aaron and Luke. And I was thinking, I don't want to put them on the spot first, but one of the things that Zach and I try to do as part of the forecast contest is we ask the students to put themselves in sort of Dave D'Arcangelo's seat. Like Dave, who works as a commodity meteorologist, has to provide forecasts on a daily basis to his end users in commodities, and to try to work on the communication aspect. Right? Obviously, Dave is very clear, concise, to the point, and has to deal with some hard questions, right? He may have to deal with traders occasionally who aren't happy with his forecast or have some questions. So I think I'm thinking that, Zach, maybe if we have either you or Michael could kind of go through the motion on that, and then maybe we could see if Aaron or Luke want to also try to do a 2-minute dry run here, a practice run of that.
All right, I can go then.
Okay, and then we always say, and this is for everyone else basically, but in particular for me and Dave D'Arcangelo, we're going to play the role of the jerkish, industry manager or whatever. So, all right, go ahead.
I'm not going to play that role, David. I just want you to know that.
Well, see, but you don't have to act, right? You don't. No.
Just joking.
All right, hi everybody. My forecast for the period of March 25th to March 29th was for 82.5 HDDs with a normal spread of 20.8. I kept my forecast formula same as the last 2 weeks, I believe. Weighting scheme is 40% on the 30-year moving average, 30% on the 10-year normal, and 30% on the trend forecast metric. Based on that period where we were going through some very, very warm verifications, I had tweaked my weighting scheme a bunch of times and then went back to my original weighting scheme from the beginning of the heating season. So I haven't had a chance for any of these to verify yet, so I don't know if this is still a strong forecast yet. But this week, if we go back to the most recent verification, we can see that although I switched my formula, we can see that if I kept it the same with the trend forecast, the 10-year normal and the 30-year moving average, it would have been a pretty decent forecast. So that gave me a little bit more confidence to continue with what I've been doing. Either way, when I was looking at the models, I saw a lot of warmth leading up to and during the period. CPC is showing a lot of warmth. The EC and the CFS were showing much of the same. So that led me to keep my spread at normal. I try not to get too overconfident. So normally I either keep it at normal spread or a lower confidence spread. So anyway, with all this warmth, I'm keeping my forecast at about 82.5. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Zach, how'd you perform last week?
Last week was not good. I had a negative 44 CRPS score that week.
Okay, so by the way, quick segue. I hate doing this with Zach because actually Zach's one of, if not the top performers over the last 6 months. So I already know that, so I'm not even going to ask that. That would be a question I might ask if someone, hey, how you performed over the last 6 months, blah, blah, blah. But I know Zach's already done well, so he's got that under his belt. So Zach, so I know last week didn't work out well. Why, is this a low confidence forecast because of what happened last week? Do you have better confidence? What's changed?
When I was going over when we were doing the forecast attribution, I kind of mentioned it that this was one of those periods where because everything had been so warm and nothing that I was doing had been really working, I was looking for looking for a new weighting scheme basically. And if I remember correctly, the week before the 18th, the EC had a good forecast, and I think the 5-year moving average, they both had good forecasts, which is why I decided to change it up and use those. I think, I will admit, last week I mentioned that I tried to never really put any weight on the EC or the CFS. I think that on the 18th, I was just looking for just a change, like a shot in the dark kind of deal. And obviously it didn't really work. So that's the reason why it was a poor performance. But like I said, I've gone back to my regular weighting scheme for this week, and I'm trying not to let the past week affect my confidence or anything like that.
All right, thank you. That will be a question. Okay. Okay. A few of the students were just mentioning that they're having trouble getting through the Albany Wi-Fi. I think Paul's going to try to help, but we'll try to help once we're offline a little bit too.
Okay.
Any other questions for Zach before we move on? All right, thank you, Zach. Hey, Luke, you want to take a shot at it? All right, Luke's going to provide a little background on his forecast. Yeah, if you want. Yeah, do you want to come up here? Whatever works. So Zach, if you don't mind clicking on Luke's, read more thing just so we can see a little bit more.
So I don't have a forecast for this current period, but my verification was awful for the period before.
Oh,
so,
okay.
I'll just talk about how I might make a forecast based on what I've looked at. So the first thing I think is, as we've talked about, it's been pretty hard to get out of a warm pattern. So when I start my forecast, I usually always look at like a 10-year normal as my baseline, just accounting for essentially that climate change signal as we continue to warm. And so then immediately my forecast, I would probably be something biased, relatively warm, relative to the average based on just what the long-term trends are. And then looking at some of the guidance I've been looking at, I think some of the models are showing a warmer signal from what I've been looking at, especially like the CFS, for example, recently has a warmer signal across the country. There is some uncertainty like the GFS showing some cold into the west, and that's captured in the Climate Prediction Center's week 2 forecast. And so I think there's uncertainty still in this as far as, there's risks for a colder pattern if things change drastically. There do seem to be some changes from our typical pattern that we've had with blocks developing in the Pacific more robustly, potentially near Alaska. And I know at least the GFS has been hinting at some North Atlantic blocking too, although it seems to be liking to do that a little too much recently. So I would probably side near normal uncertainty and warmer than normal forecast. I don't have numbers, but yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Questions for Luke? All right, Erin, do you want to take a stab at it? Because Erin did provide a forecast here. I know you're.
I did a pretty quick one last night, but that start was just, I like to look at the height anomalies at 500 hectopascals and the temperature anomalies at 850. And both the east and the west kind of had warm and higher heights at 500, so I kind of lean towards the warmer side of the temperature levels. That's what and then also AO and everyone indices, and although they're both on the positive side, which are indicating warmer temperatures, they are getting closer to neutral than they have been in the past. So I kind of lean high in my I was going to do a higher, a lower spread, but I wanted to place the average spread that was given by an excellent.
Yeah, I have a question for you. You mentioned the AO, and you mentioned that the AO leaned kind of like a warm signal. When you slightly,
Yeah.
When you how do you use the AO? Do you use it to sort of add confidence to an existing HD forecast that might already be warm? Or if you see it in a positive phase, like a warm phase, like you were mentioning, do you tend to use that as a, as a sort of almost like a semi-independent data point that pushes your forecast even warmer?
I think the latter. For my project depends how well that flows itself. So for my forecasting for this purpose, I'm trying to consider a separate factor that can push them on.
Okay. So I think that's a really interesting point. So this is something, that age-old thing we've talked about, at least, well, before this forecast contest, but many times in the forecast contest. Remember Michael, who's talked about this a lot, that, is there a systematic error associated with the AO such that you should look at it semi-independently. Dave, I wonder if we could put you on the spot here, since you're doing this all the time. When you evaluate health with AO and EPO, do you how do you utilize those signals to enhance your forecast process? I mean, how are they a part of your forecast process?
So for me, it's a matter of what is trying to force that signal. So I'm looking for the reasoning why a signal should be in that state, say in week 2 or potentially week 3. But it's with the recognition that model skill of that index is typically quite low past, say, day 10. So it's really a question of, do you have some sense of what might be trying to force that, whether it's tropically forced or whether it's, in the winter, it could be stratospherically forced. What is maybe potentially the precursor to that trying to set up, versus seeing it in isolation and then trying to just allow the forecast to come out of whatever the deterministic view of that is. And the AO has been a real bugaboo this winter, right? Because it's only really been in one state, and I think there's other things that are happening when we get these, cold potholes in the forecast, or the actualization. But really, largely since the end of December, the AO is really not deviated from, positive to extremely positive. But there's been a lot of nuance. So the index alone hasn't been sufficient enough to explain the mild winter. It's been a big part of it, but not the only.
Thank you, Dave. Hey, Zach, I wonder if it's okay if we can go a little out of order here. I wonder if, just for the students here, we can give Dave the platform for a couple minutes, just talk a little bit about his experience before we sign off. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, Dave, if you want to just go in like a little bit about your background,
Sure.
day-to-day kind of stuff, and then if you have time, you can talk about this week's forecast if you'd like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And I'd like to talk more about this week. It's a pretty interesting window, I think, even though it's the end of winter and really things shouldn't be that exciting. Just to start off with, though, I've been working at Susquehanna International. It's a private company in Philadelphia. I've been here for 14 years as a forecaster. I'm the only meteorologist at the company presently, or only one they've ever had. It's a financial institution, largely, but we do trade a good amount of commodities, and in the commodity space, primarily energy, but also agriculture at times. I'm the meteorologist to provide on-the-desk analytics for trading. So we don't have customers in the sense that we're not beholden to a producer, or we don't represent a consumer group. We're not representing some kind of interest in terms of supply or demand, but we're trading the financial portion of it. Of course, that financial portion is still driven by supply demand, and really the demand of energy is largely, especially in the electricity and natural gas space, is primarily driven by weather. And I think probably David and Dr. Roundy have covered this quite a bit. I've been in the industry about 20 years. I started with a utility in Ohio, which was very much day-to-day, short-term forecast to provide energy demands to meet customers in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, and then moved to this company in Philadelphia in 2006. I've actually been an operational forecaster for about a little more than 25 years now. I started in the Air Force as an aviation forecaster. Spent some time at Delta Airlines, got my grad degree in there along the way. But I love the idea that in operational forecasting in an industry like commodities, the challenge is that every day is a new day. Every day is an opportunity to make a prediction, to try to figure something out, to try to look at a problem a different way, to try to wade through the vast amount of information that is at your fingertips nowadays, to make a little sense of it. And I view my role as kind of wearing multiple hats. One is to make a forecast, and to try to get it right. But really that is sometimes takes us a backseat to educating people and to talk about what may be right or incorrect about the things that they're seeing. Typically people in this industry are extremely weather savvy. So it's not like you consider yourself, or I consider myself, a forecast expert on the desk, because weather information is consumed by other analysts and other traders. And they do it in a relatively high level. So you'd be surprised at how knowledgeable they become by spending even just a short time looking at weather information. So typically I'm been challenged to defend a forecast, but also to provide some education as to why something may or may not be happening, or why the market, whether it's natural gas or electricity, may or may not be responding in a given way. What are they seeing in the world? And the world today is a lot different than, say, it was even, say, 5 years ago, with the proliferation of people's consumption of places like Twitter, or seeing, other media outlets provide forecasts. There's a lot of information, and there's also a lot of misinformation out there. So it's sometimes wading through that. And then a big part of the forecast, and this might surprise some people, is it's not necessarily important, did you get the forecast right? But it's important do you see the direction that the forecasts are heading? And so it's almost like you're making a prediction of the prediction, if that makes sense. We often will ask questions like, well, when we walk in on Wednesday morning, what will the world be looking at, and how will the forecast be changing? And then, that's a particularly challenging forecast in general. And frequently we'll ask that question on a Friday, is like, well, when we come in on Monday morning, what will the world be focused on? How will they be looking at weather? What will be catching their attention, so to speak? So it's identifying a trend and talking about how forecasts change over time. So what I think you're doing in the forecast contest is really valuable. There's a piece to that that is probably would deserve some attention, and I could talk about it at much greater length as to how will that forecast of that, say, week 3 or week 4 change over time, and that's been a large part of capturing opportunities in the market, because prices will typically react to the forecast. They're not reacting to the verification. Once the verification is happening or has already happened, the market's already on to the next, whatever, 15 or 20 or 30-day forecast. And so the market is always forward-looking, and the reaction is always greatest to the trend of forecasts. So that's kind of that's just a thumbnail sketch. Do you want me to go into the forecast this week, Zach?
Yeah, unless anyone else has any questions for Dave, we can talk about the forecast.
I think,
sure.
Dave, I think, yeah, we're going to listen here, I think, to your forecast, and then we're probably going to sign off shortly after that. So I just want to give you a heads up there. But this is great. All
That's fine. And I'm going to try to be on every week, so we can kind of pick it up different, tactic every week. But I only have about 5 minutes myself, so I'm going to kind of give this a rather high-level overview. This is a challenging week coming up, the 25th to 29th. I actually think next week's verification, when we come in next Tuesday morning and dial in, that's actually going to be a fascinating verification, because there's going to be some Arctic air that comes into the middle of the country. We're seeing the Southeast Ridge intending to get squeezed more towards the East Coast. So I know if last week everyone was predicting another warm week, and that might be hanging on by its fingertips at that point. The question then becomes what happens afterwards. In the week of the 25th that we're looking at now is a peculiar window, and I think that the warm view this winter has obviously been the winning hand. When you've played the warm view, it's won out more times than not, and oftentimes to a huge degree, like we saw with this past the verification we're talking about today. As we go into spring, though, that's going to become a little bit more challenging, because some of these signals like AO will break down. I think we'll see some different seasonality influences of things like that. But the two main influences of the winter has largely been the negative AO and the large ridge in the North Pacific, which when it's kind of flexed, it's towards Alaska a little bit. It's given the models an opportunity to kind of dive cold into the middle of the continent. And when it's pulled back more towards the Aleutians and North Pacific, you're left with kind of a flat zonal flow and extremely warm conditions over the U.S. The week that we're looking at now, though, is it reminds me a little of the window we were in mid-February, and that window surprised us to the cold side. That was a period in late January and early February that was looking mild. We come out of extremely mild January. The CFS and the Euro weeklies were warm, and that mid-Feb period was a bit of a cold downdraft. The markers for why that have happened in mid-Feb, though, are a little bit unclear because the tropical forcing wasn't quite evident. The one thing I noted last week in the discussion was that we saw that as a period of a negative SOI and an enhanced subtropical jet. It delivered a lot of rain into the southeast and Texas, and that was responsible for some of the cold days down there. That is an area. That is a parameter that looks like we may be trying to trend towards again here in this late March period. The SOI is trending negative after around the 20th of the month, and I'm a little interested to see what kind of influence that can have, because as you go into the end of March, it's relatively easy to rack up some degree days in the south, because you really are almost out of HDD season from Texas to the Gulf Coast and the southeast, including like Atlanta. So 2 or 3 days of rain in there can really kind of foul up a forecast, so to speak. I'm interested about the negative SOI as a potential bugaboo to this forecast. I know the Euro weeklies last night came out extremely warm. Sometimes I view, and this is a bit of a forecast strategy, kind of macro view, is it's sometimes fun to take a large directional move, but I feel like there's times when you want to kind of preserve yourself reputationally. And today feels like one of those days that it's probably fairly easy for me, or it's easy to talk myself into doing something close to like the 10-year because I don't have a lot of conviction about being taking a large stand. I love Dr. Roundy's. I think he's at 60 HDDs that week. So that to me is a huge stand to the warm direction. So it'll be fun to watch this turn out. But my number is probably going to be something more like, 86 or 87. And I'll probably give it a little bit wider spread, something along the order of 25 or so. Recognition that there's some volatility. I know the seasonality is super warm, but this just doesn't, to me, feel like a window where I don't feel like I'm playing with a strong hand to the warm side.
Dave, how can you get the cold into the east or southeast and the bigger load zones that matter?
The cold in the southeast could probably become, I think, a stronger subtropical jet. We could, in a sense, you're not driving cold from the central Canada into the east. You're just kind of in situ creating cold because of you're creating some rain. You've got opportunities for, 2 or 3, 4 days of rain. The east is going to be a little bit more difficult. That feels like it's going to be challenging. The one thing that also might be changing is that the AO is staying positive, but we're actually developing a fairly large ridge over Scandinavia in like the 9 to 14 day window right now. That's a bit peculiar because there's a pathway to getting the positive AO to break down somewhat when you've got the ridge centered more on the Scandinavia side, than not. Now, I'm not saying it's acting in concert with what's happening maybe over the North Pacific or Alaska. I typically don't love forecasting cold when the ridge over the North Pacific is kind of migrating north and east. I really like it for more if the ridge is kind of forming naturally over the northern part of Alaska and the polar region. But the Scandinavia ridge has me a bit more curious as to why the models might just be, I don't want to say it's, the positive AO has been so compelling, but even within that, we've had these windows that have not panned out to be, extremely warm. Now, more of them have than not, but this just doesn't feel like one.
Hey, Zach, sorry to interrupt, but could you pull up like the 500 millbar height map, maybe corresponding to 16 to 20 or one of those periods? Thank you.
The departures are just the heights.
Yeah, departures. Thank you. Yeah, maybe hemispheric or global, just so we can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, this is what the 16 to 20 day map looks like. This is for the EC.
right, guys. This has been great. We're going to sign off here just to cover a couple other things before the end of the class. But thanks for making time for us, and special thanks there to Dave D'Arcangelo.
Thanks, David. I have to jump off too, but I appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Let's see. Mike, do you want to go into your forecast a little bit?
Yeah, I might as well, since I seem to be the only other warm outlier here.
Yeah, now you got a warm one.
All right, so my forecast was for 70.5 HDDs which is quite warm compared to the both 30 and 10 year. My spread was a little higher, which I'll get into as to why in a moment. Same formula that I've had for a while, mostly teleconnections with a little bit of CPC and 30-year normal sprinkled in. The main driver for this warm forecast was the negative PNA and the CPC forecast basically agreeing. The PNA looks like I think it's around -2 sigma. So it's pretty strongly negative. The AO and NAO are forecasted to be near neutral, but as has already been mentioned this year, the AO and NAO forecasts have not been great at longer range, and so far they've almost always verified positive or more on the positive end of the spread. So I'm gonna assume that's going to continue. So I didn't count these as colder signals. The CPC is basically pasting a negative PNA pattern as their forecast for this time period. So that kind of strengthened my idea there'll be a very warm forecast with 70% a chance of above normal in the northeastern part of the country, I believe it was. The reason I didn't have a normal sigma value for my spread is because the EPO is strongly negative right now and is forecast to remain that way. So that could force in some colder air into mainly the western part of the country, I would say, maybe the central part. So I increased, rather than change my forecast, which I feel good about that number in spite of, nobody really being near that. So I just increased my spread to account for the possibility that it could be a little on the colder side. I still think it'll be, even if the EPO does manage to force some cold air into the CONUS, I think it'll still be a above average in terms of, or well, below average in terms of HDDs and above average in terms of temperature forecast period. Any questions?
You mentioned, Mike, that because we were talking about this earlier, and then you just mentioned it again, that you said the CPC pattern was matching exactly what the negative PNA forecast would look like.
Yeah, I looked it up because I was curious, and it seemed to, from the images I found, it seemed to match up pretty closely.
Do you know, because I know you do weight teleconnections basically on a weekly basis, is that like one of the first times you ever seen that happen? Because I don't remember you ever mentioning that before. Is this rare?
Honestly, it's the first time I've seen it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the first time it's happened. I would imagine it's rare. I think it's a coincidence that it just happened to end up that way.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily believe in coincidences, but so I still counted it as regardless of whether or not they're actually just predicting a pattern based off of the negative PNA, which according to the discussion, I don't think they are. That just happened to work out
Yeah.
and further confirm that I think this will be a warmer period, even though my spread doesn't necessarily agree with that. But as I said, that's because of the EPO.
Is there anyone else on the call who made a forecast and would like to talk about it? We got a couple more minutes, but if not, we can end a few minutes early.
Hello.
Hey, Philip.
All right. Very quick. Essentially, what Michael said with just a few caveats. The only main difference between my forecast and Michael's forecast is one, I incorporate the 30-year moving average, which is a little cooler than the forecast, and also the I think my 10% tropical weighting in the tropical signal, I interpreted it as near the 30-year, or I interpreted that as a more uncertain forecast, and those were the main things that skewed my forecast less warm. But then I also threw in a -2 fudge factor because I felt like this period seemed pretty high confidence that it would be a warm forecast. So I also have above average confidence with the lower sigma.
Thanks, Philip. I appreciate you joining us. Yeah, compared to some of the other weeks we've had, it doesn't, I mean, yes, there's a couple values that are a lot different than the others, especially Dr. Roundy's and the CFS, but it seems to be a pretty, like, it's not a lot of spread amongst our values. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. And when Dave Margolin fixes the page, we can also see what industry number one's forecast was. But
I looked that up. I think it was 79 like 0.6 or something. So they're
okay.
on the warm side as well, even though their map doesn't. That's the one thing I never really understand about the Maxar forecast is that their number for HDDs never, to me it seems anyway, seems to match up with their map, because like looking at that seems to be about a 50-50 split, which would, to me, I mean, granted a lot of the warmth is in high demand areas, but to me that just doesn't, that to me just looks like a normal like 30-year 10-year map to me anyway, and then they come up with 79 as their numbers. It just doesn't make too much sense to me, but
yeah, I don't know. So it would always be nice to have them on and we can talk about it. And I doubt they're going into all of their details on this forecast page. So
I mean, the actual forecast itself, I get why they have the pattern set up that way, but I just don't understand how they get to their number sometimes. You know?
Yeah, here it is. Yeah, 79.4 is right here.
And CFS, of course, is always off its rocker.
New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas carry by far the lion's share of the gas-weighted HDD equation.
Yeah, well, if you base that off of Maxar's map right here, then they're all going to be in that realm, except Chicago's more north, and yeah, still in that yellow period, or that yellow color, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right.
I'd take the under on 79. I would have thought that would have been even a warmer number, but I've been looking at these maps a while. Hard to see the positive AO go away. I know Dave D'Arcangelo mentioned some interesting stuff about seeing the PV pinched a little bit on both sides, North Pacific and from Scandinavia. There's a little bit of elongation in the upper trope, lower strat PV structure for the first time in a while. That might support a little bit, deeper northwesterly flow into Central North America. I just don't have any mechanism to get good cold in the east and southeast, where New York and Atlanta to Dallas. I don't see that horseshoe getting substantial cold, and so I guess I'd be in the mid-low 70s for this week. two regions of convective forcing have been warm drivers for the core winter periods, but in the shoulders, you can get the shorter wavelengths and get colder into the Midwest. So if I had anywhere that was most at risk, I'd say Chicago, Kansas City, Denver would be the places I'd worry about surprising my forecast colder. I just don't worry that much about New York to Atlanta to New Orleans, something like that. I think they'll be pretty much on the warm side and stay there for a while.
Well, thank you, Jason, for that insight. Yeah, well, like I said, we'll have to see how this week pans out. Unless anyone else has any last thoughts, it's 11:31, so we'll wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. David D'Arcangelo, I know you left early, but again, thank you for joining us and being our special guests. And we will talk to you all next week.
See ya.
See ya. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.